Christian businessmen's meeting. I had no idea it was like this. This must be a little bit like Elijah. 700 that hadn't bowed their knee to Baal. So. Wish each one of you could come up here and just stand out here and look at this. It's the grace of God, isn't it? And that's really the story of my life. It's not a Damascus Road story. It's just a story of the grace of God. And as Mr. Warwick said, I've known him for many years, so when you're at the office and you hear Mr. Warwick was calling for you, you pick up the phone and get back as soon as you can. What a privilege to be asked. Mr. Warwick has done so much work for the Lord, and I look out and see Ned and my father-in-law, and Parks, and Steve Coggins, and Steve Rexrode, and other guys who've had an impact on my life, and what a fabulous testimony to the work of God. So I'm encouraged. I hope you're encouraged. Before I tell you my story, I do want to tell you a little bit about my wife, because one of my dearest friends is my father-in-law. And when he allowed me to marry his daughter, I had no idea the blessings were in store for him. But as Mr. Warwick said, she was quite a good basketball player. She actually was on the national championship Tar Heel team. And my wife, at one point, said that she would not marry somebody who she could beat in basketball. And if my children have any athletic talent, it is from one source of their parentage. I didn't have any. One time we were out playing at Empey, and there were a bunch of guys playing on another court, and Kim and I were playing on the other court, and we were playing one-on-one, and I had it ringing through my head that she wouldn't marry somebody who she could beat at basketball, and I wanted to marry her. And as we were playing, and I'm being beaten soundly, she puts a move on me that I can't even describe, and her head winds up against the bottom of my jaw, and my teeth come together with my tongue in between. And as both sides of my tongue were bleeding, and some guys at the other court said, "Are you all right?" And I had tears in the front of my eyes, but I didn't want to show them. My wife pats me on the back and says, "You all right?" And I was like, "Yes, yes." And anyway, God's grace, she actually broke with her promise, and she did marry me. So that is God's grace. I'm sorry to do that, but I'm still taking phone calls to the hospital. So. What I thought I would do is just walk through the work of God's grace in my life, trying to highlight things about Him and how He works. So this morning, I happen to be reading through the earlier part of Romans. And if you read in there, it talks about whether a person was Jewish or they were Gentile, God had written His requirements on the heart of man. And we call that conscience. And as a young boy who grew up in a Roman Catholic context without any particular devotion, God was gracious enough to give me a conscience. And my earliest memories are that if I were to die and meet the Lord, it wasn't going to go well. Nobody had particularly told me that. I had had nobody preach to me, and I had never had a Bible. The only Bible I was ever exposed to was one that, by God's grace, He drove me to when my siblings were at the orthodontist. And it was a basket of children's books, and I was an inveterate reader. And the one book I would go to was the children's Bible. And I would read it over and over. Didn't know the story, didn't get it, but for some reason was drawn to God's Word. So I'm grateful that in God's dealings with man, He gives them a conscience. I tried to deal with my conscience, particularly at night when I found myself regularly unsettled, by listening to things. So I always was listening to talk radio, and it wasn't what it is today. It was just local people talking about local issues. It was a way of drowning out the voice of the Lord in my head. My dad did give me a strong work ethic, and the first thing I bought was a little television set with an antenna, a little black and white television set, $95, I'll never forget it. And I used to watch that at night. Again, trying to drown out conscience. It was a time of the Vietnam draft, and my father had a friend who used to visit us, and he would tease me that I was going to be drafted. They were starting to lower the age down to my age, which was 7 or 8. I wasn't smart enough at that point to realize that wasn't really true. And I told him, well, that's okay, I just won't shoot straight. And he said, that's all right, they'll teach you. And I remember going to sleep at night. I was worried that I would get drafted to the war, be killed, and meet God unprepared. So just in case anybody here doesn't know the Lord, and your conscience is at work, I would ask you not to suppress it with talk radio, other explanations, television, work, people, electronics, you name it. Now God has given you a conscience, and I'm grateful for the one He gave me. In college, I was exposed, or actually, I'm sorry, in high school, I was exposed to a youth ministry called Young Life. Many of you are probably aware of that. I see Ned shaking his head. He's been actively involved with that for years. And I went to the meetings, not so much because I was interested in God. Quite frankly, I wasn't. Didn't know who God was. I went for the social aspect. There were people there, and I wanted to interact. It was an opportunity that my parents would allow me out of the house in the evening. And it was the first time that I heard anybody pray something other than a rote or formula prayer. And it was the first time that I saw somebody in public walk around with a Bible. Many of you grew up in the South. You can't imagine a context like that. But this was life in Pennsylvania in the late 60s, early 70s. People didn't walk around with Bibles. They didn't talk about them, in my context at least. And what I was exposed to is the reality that there are Christian people in the world. And that principle would be the principle of the sheep and the goats. God in His Word clearly tells us there are only 2 destinies for man, heaven or hell. There's no timeshare in between. There's no border ground between the two. There's no demilitarized zone between the two. There's no exchange of prisoners between the two. 2 outcomes. And I was exposed to a group of people that were heading one direction, and I was heading another. And God in His faithfulness continues to pursue me in college. And in the context of flag football, of which I was no good at that either, there was a fellow who decided that one of his most pleasurable things to do was catch touchdowns against me, and he would do it every play. But he was so gracious to me. Every time he beat me, he'd turn around, pat me on the back, and say, "You're going to get me next time," that sort of thing. Well, he asked to be my roommate my second year. And Cliff, his name was a Christian. And he began to take me to church, a small Baptist church off the campus at Virginia Tech. And I would go most Sundays and participate in worship. And Cliff, I am sure, explained the gospel to me. But I learned another principle of how God works and what the effects of the fall were. I had a dead heart. There was no life in it. And I realized that just the exposure to the Bible, as important and necessary as it is, was not enough. Because for 2 years, people were talking to me about the content of the Bible, and I did not understand a single thing. It wasn't though I understood it and resisted it. I didn't get it. It was like I was unconscious. If you asked me, what did you hear during those years? I don't know. I was in a building. I didn't know a thing. And God talks about that in His Word. He says we were dead in our trespasses. We were dead in Adam. We weren't sick. We weren't in the ICU. We weren't hanging on for dear life. We were 1,000 leagues under the deepest ocean. Dead. And that's what Great Bebb was. I left college and the faithful friendship of Cliff. And God has me in Philadelphia. And I was enrolled at Thomas Jefferson University Hospital, Jefferson Medical College. This medical college had the largest freshman class in the country, over 200. That's sizable for a medical school class, most of which are 70 to 110. And in God's mercy, the first 3 men I meet love your God. The first was assigned to me, and I would have said it was assigned to me randomly. But once I began to read God's Word, I learned another principle of God's providence. He is using all things together for the good of those who He has called according to His purpose in Christ Jesus. And my roommate was the son of a man named Jim Thompson. Jim Thompson had a tape ministry outside of Pittsburgh in a little town called Ligonier. And he had invited out for the summer a young Pittsburgh seminary student, R.C. Sproul, to work. And I see many heads shaking up and down. So my medical school roommate grew up with R.C. Sproul at his home every summer. Bill loved the Lord. He was about a 4th generation faithful Christian. I went to medical school to my first class, and I sat next to a fellow, Andy Ruzick, also a very faithful Christian man, who openly declared his love for Jesus Christ. The third person I met was in another blind-hearted athletic attempt, going to play basketball that afternoon, the first day of medical school with the guys. And I met a fellow named Brad Offord. His dad was the president of the Mission to the World Board for the Presbyterian Church of America. Brad had grown up a faithful son of Christian missionaries in Chile, Santiago, and he knew the Lord. Now, what was interesting was none of these three guys knew each other. And on day 2 of medical school, I get up with Andy, who I was sitting next to, and he said, "What are you doing for lunch?" And he takes me. And as we're walking out, we run into my medical school roommate, Bill Thompson. And he says, "Hey, Greg, what are you guys doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to lunch with my friend Andy. Would you like to join us?" Bill, Andy, Bill. Yes. So we start walking to Reading Terminal. I don't know if any of you have been there in Philadelphia, but it's a big place where there's people of all sorts of ethnicities. There's people coming and going. It's just a hodgepodge of individuals. You could eat anything you want. And on our way down to Reading Terminal, we run into the athletic fellow I knew, Brad Offord. And he says, "Greg, what are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to lunch. You want to meet my friends Andy and Bill?" Well, this became a foursome, and we would go out every day to lunch. And one thing I noticed was these guys were different. Like that Young Life group I had met. They were in another world. I didn't quite know what they were talking about. I'm sure they were talking about the Lord. But again, it didn't register. But these men were large. They were weighty. They had substance. Entirely different from me. And the way I like to describe it is I felt a little bit like the boy who's out in the cold at the orphanage on Thanksgiving Day, looking through the frosted window at the owners of the orphanage who are sitting at the Thanksgiving feast. And I didn't know what world these guys were in, but I wasn't in it. But it looked warm in there, and it looked nourishing, and I wanted to be a part of it. Well, they invited me to church, and in God's grace, I learned another principle. How beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. If you are a Christian here today, somebody brought the good news to you. God uses people to share the gospel. So before I go forward, let me ask, is there somebody in your family? Is there somebody in your business? Is there somebody in your neighborhood that you haven't talked about Christ with? That somebody could be me. I think many times we build bridges with people, don't we? But we never walk the gospel across. A clear discussion about the good news of Jesus Christ. Well, these men invite me to church, and it is a historic church. Anybody who has researched at all the attacks on the Bible of the 1900s will know the name James Montgomery Boyce. James Montgomery Boyce was the pastor of this church, 10th Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia. He was the president of the International Council on Biblical Inerrancy. He helped design the Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy. They fought back against theological liberalism. If you don't know what that is, I'm not talking Republicans and Democrats. Theological liberalism starts with a particular idea that the Bible contains the Word of God. Orthodox Christianity says the Bible is the Word of God. And the difference between containing the Word of God and being the Word of God is two entirely different worlds. And James Montgomery Boyce, John MacArthur, and others stood against theological liberalism. When you hold your Bible, you're holding the words of the eternal God. It is important for you to read it personally in the morning. Gather your family together every night to read it, and gather together with God's people on Sunday to hear it preached. Well, I wind up in 10th Presbyterian Church, and Dr. Boyce is doing his usual line-by-line teaching. He's finishing up the book of Genesis, and of course he's teaching about the character of Joseph. He had been on the book of Genesis for 8 years. And I was sitting there thinking, I've never seen a Bible. And this guy's on one book for 8 years. And he's teaching about Joseph. And I remember having an epiphany. He thinks Joseph was real. He thinks this stuff happened. And he was brilliant. You talk about diction, erudition, organization, presentation. This man was a preacher for the nation. And I was blown away by his education and erudition, much more than his message. And I would go back even Sunday night. My 3 friends, who all loved the Lord, they weren't brought up with the idea of morning and evening worship. And in the morning service, Dr. Boyce would say, tonight we'll be preaching on such and such. And my buddies would be studying or watching a football game. And here the pagan was, I said, let's go to church. Aren't you going back? That guy's teaching again. What's this minor prophet stuff? And I would make my way back Sunday night in Philadelphia. And I was just staggered that somebody would take this book seriously. And I was writing notes very quickly. How much time do I have left? Just so I know. 5 minutes. And Dr. Boyce begins preaching on Romans chapter 1. And I'm sitting in the top right-hand balcony. And Dr. Boyce preaches on the depravity of man. You're dead in your trespasses. There's no hope on the ground. And I'm writing in my little spiral brown notebook as fast as I can. And I stop. And I'm staring down from that balcony. And I said, he's talking to me. He's saying that men are depraved, but he's saying that about me. Greg Bebb. I liken it to the old Wizard of Oz movie. I had been living in a black and white world, and the red shoes showed up. It was the first sense of color in the spiritual realm I had. I don't know how I made it back from that church, 10 Philadelphia city blocks, and if you've been there, you know how people drive there. I don't know how I made it back safely, because I don't remember a thing about walking back. I was stunned. It was going over and over in my head that he just said I was to pray. And in God's grace, a week later, he opened my heart for the solution. Jesus Christ said, "Come unto me," and he said, "All those who come unto me, I've lost not one." I came to preach the good news. Come, drink without buying, without money. Enter by the narrow gate. For wide is the gate, broad is the road that leads to destruction. Many enter through it, but small is the gate, and narrow the road that leads to life. And very few find it. Oh, I wept. Very much over my sin. Grief, tears. But very much over my Savior. Joy, tears. Have you shed those? I don't know, maybe you're like me, and some Christian men invited you along, and you thought, these men are weighty at this road. But I'm out in the cold. Come to Christ. Now is the time of salvation. You encourage me. I pray I have encouraged you. And may you accomplish much